A few interesting facts about Satan. Satan is a Hebrew language word whose literal meaning is adversary or accuser. The first time, it appeared in the Tanakh, which is the sacred scripture of Judaism, and it is written in the Hebrew language. Tanakh is also called the Hebrew Bible. It has 3 divisions. The first part is called Torah, meaning instructions or law, and it has 5 books. It details the creation of the universe, our world, and all living beings. It starts with Adam and Eve and ends with Moses. The second part consists of prophets called Nevi'im, or prophets, and the third part is called Ketuvim, or writings. Tanakh is an acronym, made from the first Hebrew letter of each of the 3 traditional divisions, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Christianity retained Tanakh with the name of the Old Testament without any change of word or comma and made it the first part of its Christian Bible. Christianity added the second part, which is comprised of certain books collectively called the New Testament. Both parts are called the Christian Bible. After God, Satan is the second most known personality in the history of mankind. Satan is believed to have been in existence even before the creation of life, and he will be here, as per religious prophecies, till the end of time. Thus, he is an eternal being and, for the time being, immune to death. He is omnipresent and considered to be in every nook and cranny of the world. Every sin or loathsome act is attributed to him. No one, except God, can surpass Satan's prowess. Satan is also an invisible figure, and except for certain purported claims attributed to a few religious figures, no one has ever seen him physically. We will present a few facts about Satan that may be entirely new to viewers. We will request you to watch the video with an open mind until the end. We will not cite or give any reference to those books and sources that are doubtful and thus not credible. Our only source of information is the Old Testament, which is believed by both religions, Judaism and Christianity. In this video, we will not present lengthy, boring, and ambiguous references. Every reference and its explanation have been presented in a very clear and simple way so that every viewer, regardless of his or her level of education, intelligence, or knowledge, can understand it. Before we start, we make a humble submission that we have been presenting entertaining and interesting videos on this channel. We need your support and request that you subscribe to our channel, like it, press the bell icon, leave a comment, and share it with your friends if you like the video. The myth that Satan tempted Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. People generally believe that Satan tempted Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and engineered their expulsion from it. This is not a true and accurate account of the biblical story of Adam and Eve because this story neither mentions the name of Satan nor does it tell any role of Satan in it. Interestingly, Satan is surprisingly non-existent in the entire story. The biblical story of Adam and Eve only mentions the snake that persuaded Eve to eat the forbidden fruit. The Jewish theologians rewrote the story of Adam and Eve and replaced the character of a snake with Satan, insisting that it was not the snake but Satan who was instrumental in the exit of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. Is it true? No, this is the wrong assertion. Let us see what the Old Testament says about it. The Old Testament categorically rejects the argument that the snake was Satan. It makes it crystal clear that it was a real snake that tempted Eve in the story. He was then, accordingly, punished by God for his act of deceit. It says that when God knew the role of the snake in deceiving Eve and Adam, he announced punishments for the three characters of the story, which were Adam, Eve, and the snake only. Nowhere is it mentioned that God also punished Satan in the story, though the Jewish and Christian theologians put the entire blame on Satan for the eviction of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. They insist the punishment of the snake was the punishment of Satan. In this story, after knowing the snake's role, God cursed and condemned him and commanded punishment, that he would slither on its belly and eat dust all his life. God also created animosity between people and snakes forever, verses 14 and 15 of chapter 3 of the first biblical book of Genesis say, "And the Lord God said unto the serpent, Because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle, and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed, it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." Today, we know that snakes slide on the belly and have animosity towards mankind, but this is not the case with Satan. In every depiction of Satan in religious literature, fiction books, movies, sculptures, or paintings, he is shown with legs. Nowhere is Satan shown as a legless creature that crawls on the earth. Even the books of the Old Testament testify that Satan has legs. In the biblical book of Job, Satan walks while visiting the earth. Verse 7 of chapter 1 of the book of Job says, "And the Lord said unto Satan, From whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down upon it." The book of Zechariah is the 38th book as well as the second last book of the Old Testament. It also mentions Satan standing in the court of God. This book's verse 1 of chapter 3 says, "And he shewed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to resist him." These verses contradict the Jewish and Christian theologians' claim that the snake was Satan in the Adam and Eve story. In fact, it was a real snake that was punished by God, and we see today that snakes slither on their bellies in this world. If the snake had been Satan, then today he would have been without legs, and instead of walking, he would have been dragging himself on the earth. Alternatively, we accept that God punished Adam, Eve, and the snake but spared Satan. The myth of fallen angels. Most people believe in the myth of fallen angels as a true occurrence in religious literature. This myth has been made popular by fiction books, movies, songs, paintings, sculptures, and stories by the semi-literate religious leaders of Judaism and Christianity. The term fallen angels is used for those angels who are claimed to be expelled from heaven due to their sins. Interestingly, this myth or the literal term, fallen angels, does not appear in any book of the Old Testament. What is the story of the fallen angels? The idea of fallen angels is derived from the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees. Both books narrate the different stories. The Book of Enoch mentions a story about the Watchers, who were angels. They became enamored with women on earth, and slept with them. The offspring of these unions, and the knowledge angels gave to mankind, corrupted people and the earth. They had many leaders, but prominent were Azazel and Samiaza. Azazel introduced men to the vast array of the forbidden arts, therefore, God singled him out for the corruption of the earth. Finally, God sent the archangel Raphael to chain Azazel in the desert, Dudiel, as punishment. The Book of Jubilees presents an altogether different story about fallen angels. In this book, the Watchers, who were angels, came to the earth and fell for the women. They copulated with human women and bore children who created chaos and bloodshed on the earth. God sent angels who bound the Watchers in the depths of the earth as punishment. Later on, another angel called Mastema requested God to spare some of the condemned angels so he might use them to lead mankind astray. God permitted him, and he became the leader of these condemned angels. Since then, Mastema and these condemned angels have been tempting people to sin. Both books are considered pseudepigrapha books in Judaism. The pseudepigrapha literature was mostly produced during the 400 silent years. This period is calculated between the ministry of Malachi in 420 BC and the appearance of John the Baptist in the early 1st century AD. This period is called the Silent Years because, during this period, God neither sent any prophets nor revealed anything to the Jews. There were several books of pseudepigrapha literature, but all were rejected by Judaism because they presented different points of view on several biblical persons, events, and histories that were, mostly, irreconcilable with the Old Testament. The pseudepigrapha books made additions, deletions, and even introduced several made-up stories in Judaism that were in contravention of the Old Testament. No one knows till today who wrote these books, but their unknown writers gave the names of various towering figures mentioned in the Bible to their books to lend credence to their written work. The myth of the fallen angels is presented in the books of this literature. The names of a few such other books are Assumption of Moses, Letter of Orestes, Ascension of Isaiah, Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, Apocalypse of Zephaniah, Testament of Solomon, Testament of Adam, Apocalypse of Abraham, and Apocalypse of Daniel, to name a few. As we mentioned earlier, the story of fallen angels is not mentioned in the entire Bible. The Jewish and Christian theologians, influenced by the pseudepigrapha literature, have twisted factual positions, cited certain verses of two stories of the Old Testament, and linked them with fallen angels. The first story is Noah's flood, where the sons of God have been mentioned, who married the daughters of men and produced mighty children. Verses 1 to 4 of chapter 6 of the book of Genesis say, "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown." These are the only verses that mention the sons of God in Noah's story in the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Torah. The viewers can see themselves. Is there any reference to fallen angels in these verses? The Jewish theologians insist the sons of God were fallen angels. How did they reach this conclusion? Which scripture supports their contention? No one answers these questions. In the same vein, Jewish and Christian theologians also link fallen angels with the words watcher, holy ones mentioned in chapter 4 of the book of Daniel. These words are related to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who saw a dream in which watchers, holy ones, alluding to angels, announcing what would happen in the future. There is nothing in this dream that can be related to the myth of fallen angels and Satan. Today the majority of Jews and Christians believe in the story of fallen angels being true and mentioned in the Bible, which is a false narrative. They believe Satan is one of the fallen angels. There is no such story of fallen angels, nor is any such incident mentioned in the Old Testament or the New Testament. Only 2 discredited books of pseudepigrapha literature narrate the fictitious story, but even the name of Satan is not mentioned in both stories. Satan and the devil are 2 different entities. People generally believe Satan and the devil are the 2 names of the same entity, which is not factually correct. In the Old Testament, Satan and the devil are 2 different beings. All the books of the Old Testament were written in the Hebrew language, except for the books of Daniel and Ezra, which were in the Aramaic language. All these books used 2 words, Satan for adversary and accuser, and Shorim for idols. The English translators translated the word Shorim into the devil in their English translations. Both words have different meanings. In the Old Testament, there are only a few instances where the word Shorim has been used with the meaning of idols. Not a single reference to the devil is related to Satan. The first reference to the devil is mentioned in the biblical book of Leviticus, which is the 3rd book of the Torah. In this book, God commands Moses to convey to Aaron, his children, and all Israelites that henceforth it was the law to sacrifice for God only, and no one could sacrifice for the devils, meaning idols. Verse 7 of chapter 17 of the book of Leviticus says, "And they shall no more offer their sacrifices unto devils, after whom they have gone a-whoring. This shall be a statute forever unto them throughout their generations." Here, the word Shorim was used for idols in the Hebrew Old Testament. The second reference to the devil appears in the book of Deuteronomy, which is the 5th book of the Torah. Here, God is angry about why Jews offer sacrifice to idols and not to God. Verse 17 of chapter 32 of the book of Deuteronomy says, "They sacrificed unto devils, not to God, to gods whom they knew not, to new gods that came newly up, whom your fathers feared not." In this verse again, the word Shorim was used in the Hebrew Old Testament for the devil, not Satan. The devil is again mentioned for the 3rd time in the biblical book 2 Chronicles, and its meaning is the same idols that the Jews made and worshipped. There were 12 tribes of Jews in Israel and Judea. After the death of King Solomon, the 10 northern tribes of the Jews revolted under Jeroboam against Rehoboam, who was a son and heir to King Solomon. Jeroboam established his rule over the kingdom of Israel. Rehoboam was left to rule over the kingdom of Judah only. After becoming king, Jeroboam indulged in idolatry. Verses 14 and 15 of chapter 11 of the book 2 Chronicles say, "The Levites even abandoned their pasture lands and property and came to Judah and Jerusalem, because Jeroboam and his sons had rejected them as priests of the Lord. When he appointed his own priests for the high places and for the devils and for the calf which he had made." In these verses, Jewish priests complained about Jeroboam, saying that he had barred them from performing their priestly duties and had instead appointed his priests for high places and for worshipping the idols, which were mostly hairy goat and calf idols. This indicates Jeroboam started worshipping idols, which were in the shape of goats and calves. The worship of animals, especially calves, was not new for the Israelites. Earlier, Aaron also made a golden calf, and Jews had begun worshipping it. God was indignant when he saw the Jews indulged in this heathen practice. When Moses returned from Mount Sinai and saw this apostasy, he immediately punished the Israelites by killing 3,000 people. All the above cited verses clearly show that Satan and the devil are separate figures, against the popular belief that both are the names of the same entity. This error occurred due to the translation of the New Testament into English. In the New Testament, the devil and Satan are one figure, not separate ones, and both words are used interchangeably. With the spread of Christianity in the world, people got the impression from the New Testament and Christian missionaries that Satan and the devil were the two names for the same entity. The Christian Church mentions both Satan and the devil as one figure, ignoring the historical evidence. Several books and movies depict the same wrong impression. Satan is a close aide of God. The biblical story of Adam and Eve is in the first book of the Old Testament, and it is set in a time when mankind had not yet started. Only Adam and Eve were in existence. Abrahamic religions accuse Satan of being pivotal in the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. If this had been true, then Satan would have been a condemned entity throughout the Old Testament, starting from the first book, but surprisingly, Job's story, which is given in the 18th book of the Old Testament, contradicts such an accusation. The first 5 books of the Old Testament are called the Torah. The last book of the Torah ends with the death of Moses, who lived during Pharaoh's time. Chapter from 38 to 42 of the book of Job show that Job had an exalted position as he spoke directly with God. Therefore, had Job existed before Moses' time, his account should have been definitely included in the Torah's 5 books, but this is not the case, and Job's story is not narrated in the Torah. In other words, it can be safely deduced that Job's time was after Moses' era, when mankind had spread far and wide in the world. In the book of Job, Satan visits God, being very close to him, and seemingly occupying a very important position. Verse 6 of chapter 1 of the book of Job says, "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them." Besides, Satan speaks directly with God and discusses with him his assigned work, and God does not utter a single word against him. Verses 7 and 8 of chapter 1 of the book of Job say, "And the Lord said unto Satan, From whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down upon it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God, and escheweth evil? These 2 verses exhibit Satan's holding a very important position before God, and he is not a condemned being as people perceive. God asks Satan where he has been, and Satan replies, From going and fro on the earth and from walking up and down upon it. It means Satan visits the earth all the time, shuttling between the earth and heaven. Then God inquires about Job and opines that Job is a pious and upright person who fears God, and therefore, Job should be considered in the unique position of being God's true believer. It shows God knew that Satan had knowledge of every human being on earth, which is why he broached the topic of Job's piety and devotion to him. With God such a positive opinion about Job, Satan did not show any ignorance about Job and talked with God in a manner that conveyed the impression that he already knew Job and that he was under his constant watch. It alludes to the fact that Satan had knowledge about all the people on earth, and he was well aware of their deeds too, and God also knew it. That is why he opened the discussion with Satan about Job's dedication. These two verses and the following several verses in the story of Job badly damaged the customary religious narrative presented by Judaism and Christianity that Satan is a condemned being from the beginning, as he is an adversary to God and people, and he was expelled from heaven while still tempting people to deviate from the right path. On the contrary, in the Old Testament, Satan is a regular visitor to God, and he is the only one in the heavenly world with whom God directly converses. In Job's story, Satan is shown as a very responsible, God-abiding, and higher-level celestial being who works within the limits laid down by God. Every time, he asks God's permission for a certain task against Job, and when he gets approval from God, then he acts within his bounds. When he becomes unsuccessful in his effort to bend Job, he again comes to God and seeks his permission for another work. There is not a single occasion in the entire book of Job where Satan has been shown violating any of God's commands, breaking his trust, or transgressing his limit. Satan as prosecutor in the court of God. In the Old Testament, there is not a single instance when Satan has been called or labeled as evil. This word, Satan, has been used in two meanings in the Old Testament. Firstly, as an adversary of people who keep an eye on their misdeeds, and secondly, as an accuser or God's prosecutor in the court of God to get people punished for their misdeeds once they die. The Old Testament does not mention his other role. The proof of Satan's position as accuser or God's prosecutor is clearly described in the book of Zechariah, which is the 38th book of the Hebrew Bible, as well as Psalms, which is the 19th book of the Old Testament. In the book of Zechariah, Satan is standing at the right hand of the Messiah before the angel of the Lord. Verse 1 of chapter 3 of the book of Zechariah says, "And he shewed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to resist him." In this verse, Satan is present on the right side of the Messiah to contradict whatever the Messiah would say in his defense. This verse depicts a court scene in which the Messiah and Satan are standing before the angel of God. Messiah is standing as an accused person, and he has to face Satan, God's prosecutor, who is standing at his right side. The exact words used in this verse are, "to resist him," which unquestionably meant whatever the Messiah would say in his defense. It is the duty of Satan to counter him as a prosecutor of God. One can also wonder, this is the second last book of the Old Testament, and Satan is not shown as a condemned person, but rather he is working in the court of God in the position of his prosecutor, and he is prosecuting none other than the Messiah himself. His presence in the court of God itself demolishes the popular belief that he is an enemy of God and a condemned fellow in the eyes of God. The next reference to Satan as the prosecutor is in Psalm 109, where King David prays to God that he should set a wicked man over his enemy and Satan at his adversary's right hand. Verse 6 of Psalm 109 of the book of Psalms says, "Set thou a wicked man over him, and let Satan stand at his right hand." This is very confusing because if Satan is taken in its traditional role of being an evil entity and an adversary to God, then this verse does not make any sense, as how King David asks God to place Satan on the right side of his enemy. Why is he praying to God to invite a condemned and evil Satan into God's court and ask him to stand there, and for what purpose? If this verse is read in light of chapter 3 of the book of Zechariah, which we have already discussed earlier, then it will be obvious what it means and why King David was beseeching God in this verse. If Satan's meaning is taken as prosecutor or accuser of people for judging their deeds, then this verse will be easily understandable that King David was praying to God to depute Satan on the right side of his enemy, because he knew that Satan, being the most competent prosecutor, should prosecute his enemy, so he would have no chance to escape from the punishment for his evil deeds. This verse is a robust acknowledgement of Satan's performance, as tasked by God, that he does his job exceptionally well. The quoted verse, "Set thou a wicked man over him, and let Satan stand at his right hand," is not a solitary verse. This verse is connected with verse 7 of Psalm 109, which conveys King David's real intention for this specific prayer when he says, "When he shall be judged, let him be condemned, and let his prayer become sin." In this verse, King David clearly mentions the duty of Satan as a very efficient prosecutor, and he knows that if Satan is placed as his enemy's accuser, then the wicked man will surely be condemned and punished, and he will have no way out to save himself. Due to his exceptional competence, Satan will prove beyond any doubt the wicked man's sins. There can never be a more explicit admission of Satan's real work as the prosecutor in the court of God and his presence there, as described in verse 7 of Psalm 109. This verse enacts a very simple scene if verses 6 and 7 of Psalm 109 are read together. The verse depicts a courtroom situation in which King David's adversary is presented in the court of God. A wicked man, a strict and malicious policeman who is deputed to make prisoners' lives like hell, is set over the enemy. Satan stands as a prosecutor to detail the adversary's misdeeds before God, who will judge the adversary based on his deeds as presented by God's official prosecutor, Satan. King David wants a confirmed and severe punishment for his tormentor, which is why he prays that the most able and capable prosecutor be deputed against his foe so that he cannot escape punishment. Satan is not Lucifer. Lucifer is a very common name given to Satan. However, this name does not exist in the original Hebrew Old Testament or its Greek translation, Septuagint. This name Lucifer was coined by Saint Jerome of Stridon, a Christian priest and theologian, by mistranslating verse 12 of chapter 14 of the book of Isaiah from the Hebrew Old Testament into Latin in the 5th century AD. This Latin translation is called Vulgate. The Hebrew Old Testament's verse 12 of chapter 14 in the book of Isaiah does not mention the name Lucifer. It mentions an unknown and mysterious name, Helo ben Shahar, instead. Let us see how the name Helo ben Shahar was changed to Lucifer. Verse 12 of chapter 14 of the Hebrew book of Isaiah mentions the following. This is its translation in English. How you fell from heaven, Helo son of Shahar. You were hacked down to the earth, one defeating over nations. Saint Jerome's translation from the Hebrew language to the Latin language is given in English language. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, who didst rise in the morning? How art thou fallen to the earth, that didst wound the nations? A marked difference is visible between the Hebrew text and the Latin translation. The Hebrew text specifically mentions a name called Helo ben Shahar. The entire Bible does not mention anything about it. This name is one of many puzzling mysteries in the Bible, and nothing is known yet why this name has been mentioned in verse 12 of chapter 14 of the book of Isaiah or who this person was. Saint Jerome, instead of exploring the name and tracing out its history or usage in the book of Isaiah, chose a convenient way and assumed the verse 12 of chapter 14 of Isaiah indicates toward Satan, whereas nothing in this verse points out anything toward Satan. Saint Jerome's erroneous inference was due to the following misconceptions. First, in the Hebrew language, the meaning of the word Helel was the shining, brilliant one. Second, the full name, as mentioned in the Hebrew Old Testament, was Helel bin Shahar, in which Shar was the god of dawn and twin brother of Shalim, the god of dusk in the pagan religion. Third, the planet Venus was also bright, and it was called the morning or evening star in the ancient Roman era because it reached maximum brightness shortly before sunrise or shortly after sunset. As the morning star, Venus heralded the daylight. In Latin language, the Venus planet is called Lucifer, meaning light-bearer. Fourth, Saint Jerome wrongly connected the word Shahar, the god of dawn, with the words, "How you have fallen from heaven," and presumed it was Satan, whom God cast down from heaven to the earth when he, allegedly, revolted against him. Thus, he interpreted, without any reason or justification, the name Helel bin Shar with Satan. In the Hebrew Bible, no such incident of Satan revolting against God and being hurled down to earth from heaven has been given. It is a fictitious story that has not been mentioned anywhere, either in the Old Testament or the New Testament. Fifth, in the entire Old Testament, the word Lucifer has not been used with Satan or without Satan. The naming of Lucifer to Satan was a comprehension mistake of Saint Jerome, and instead of correcting it, every new translation carries on this mistake by following the traditional line in centuries-old popular but erroneous belief. Different names given to Satan have no relevance to him. Satan has been called by various names, but surprisingly, he has no relation to any of them. Satan has been associated with these names due to myths or preconceived notions that Satan is evil, so all such names that are related to evil or have a negative meaning have been attributed to Satan. We have already mentioned Snake and Lucifer, so now we discuss a few such names. His first name is Azazel, which appears in the biblical book of Leviticus. It was actually an idol for whom a goat was earmarked for sacrifice side by side with God. Verses from 6 to 10 of chapter 16 of the book of Leviticus say, "And Aaron shall offer his bullock of the sin offering, which is for himself, and make an atonement for himself and for his house. And he shall take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And Aaron shall cast lots upon the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord and the other lot for the Azazel. And Aaron shall bring the goat upon which the Lord's lot fell, and offer him for a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell to be the Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord, to make an atonement with him and to let him go for Azazel into the wilderness." Interestingly, now the English translations do not use the original word of the Hebrew Bible, Azazel, but to hoodwink readers, the word scapegoat is used instead. Leviticus is the 5th book of the Old Testament. If we assume that Satan is Azazel, then how is it possible that God would command the Jews to offer 1 goat to him and 1 goat to Satan after drawing lots, which alludes to the notion that both are equal? The later book, called the Book of Job, shows that Satan is an obedient angel of God, and he never transgresses any command given to him. There is not a single word in the Bible that connects Satan to Azazel. The second such name is Beelzebub. This was the name of a god of the ancient Philistine people, and this deity was worshipped in the Ekron area. Ekron was the name of one of the 5 city-states of the Philistine Confederacy called Philistia, or the land of the Philistines, during ancient times. The other city-states were Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gath. As the Philistines and the Jews had a long rivalry, the Israelites attributed this idol's name to Satan without any linkage or evidence. The third name is Mastema. This name is neither mentioned in the Old Testament nor the New Testament. This name appears only in the Book of Jubilees, which we earlier mentioned, is a pseudepigrapha book, and it has been rejected by Jewish as well as Christian theologians. Another name is Belial. Jewish and Christian theologians also associate Satan with the name Belial. In the Old Testament, Belial's identity, or his origin, is not given. He is depicted as a wicked, worthless, or troublesome person only. Belial is composed of 2 common words, Beli meaning without, and Yaal meaning to be of value, thus, without worth. The name Belial has appeared 27 times in the Old Testament, and out of which, 15 times it is mentioned along with his sons, as sons of Belial. Everyone knows Satan has no father, son, or any other family member.